It was a quiet afternoon in Lakewood, a small town known for its friendly people and peaceful streets. Officer Daniel Carter, a seasoned patrol officer with over 15 years of experience, cruised through the neighborhood in his police car. His eyes scanned the empty sidewalks, looking for anything unusual. To him, it was just another day on the job. Suddenly, his radio crackled with a call. "We've got reports of a disturbance near Pinewood Avenue," the dispatcher announced. Carter adjusted his hat, feeling a sense of importance. A disturbance? In this quiet neighborhood? It was rare, and that made him eager to respond. He arrived at the scene within minutes. The area seemed calm, with no obvious sign of trouble. Then, Carter noticed a man standing near a car. He was tall and well-built, wearing plain clothes, a leather jacket, and dark jeans. The man was looking at a clipboard in his hands, occasionally glancing at the parked car. To Carter, this looked suspicious. "Hey," Carter called out, stepping out of his vehicle. The man turned toward him, raising his hand in a polite gesture of acknowledgement. He didn't seem nervous or defensive, but Carter felt his instincts kick in. Something about this man didn't sit right with him. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," Carter commanded, placing his hand on his belt, near his holstered weapon. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly confused, but he complied. He stepped away from the car and put the clipboard down. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the man said calmly. "I'm Chief Marcus Hale. I'm with the police department." Carter paused for a moment, then narrowed his eyes. Chief Hale. This man didn't look like a chief. He wasn't in uniform, and Carter had never seen him before. "I need to see some ID," Carter said firmly. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for Carter to see. "This should clear up the confusion," Marcus said with a steady tone. Carter stared at the badge, but his suspicions only grew. "Fake badges are easy to make," Carter muttered under his breath. He stepped closer, looking Marcus up and down. "You're claiming to be the new chief." Marcus remained calm, despite the rising tension. "I don't have to claim anything," he replied. "I am the chief." "Now, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." But Carter wasn't convinced. He glanced around the street, noticing a few curious neighbors peeking through their windows. His pride and authority were on the line, and he wasn't about to let this man, whoever he was, take control of the situation. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Carter barked, his tone sharp. The man's calm demeanor only irritated him more. Carter's hand moved closer to his weapon as his suspicions continued to build. The scene was about to take a dramatic turn. The quiet neighborhood had turned into a stage for an unfolding drama. Officer Daniel Carter stood stiffly, his hand hovering near his gun, as he stared down Marcus Hale, the man claiming to be the new police chief. Neighbors cautiously watched from behind curtains, whispering to each other about what was happening. Marcus, still calm and collected, raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "Officer, I suggest you take a step back and think this through," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't how we handle things." But Carter wasn't listening. His mind raced with doubt and suspicion. In his view, Marcus didn't fit the image of someone who could be in charge. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't someone Carter recognized. And to him, the situation just didn't add up. "Don't move," Carter snapped, ignoring Marcus's explanation. "You're not going anywhere until we sort this out." Marcus took a deep breath. He had spent years in law enforcement, handling far worse situations than this, but it still amazed him how quickly assumptions could cloud judgment. He could see the tension in Carter's posture, the way his hand stayed close to his weapon, and he knew this could spiral out of control if he wasn't careful. "I've already shown you my badge," Marcus said calmly. "If you need further proof, call the station. They'll confirm everything." Carter's lips tightened. He glanced at the badge again but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Badges can be faked. You think I'm just going to take your word for it?" He shot back, his voice rising. Meanwhile, more neighbors had come outside, drawn by the raised voices. A few had their phones out, recording the interaction. Carter noticed this, and it only added to his frustration. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, and his pride wouldn't let that happen. "I'm not repeating myself," Carter barked. "Step away from the car, keep your hands where I can see them, and don't try anything funny." Marcus did as instructed, but his patience was wearing thin. "Officer," he said, keeping his voice calm, "you're making a mistake. I understand you're trying to do your job, but this is not the way to handle it." Carter felt a surge of anger at those words. A mistake. No one questioned his judgment, especially not someone he didn't trust. He stepped closer, his hand now resting firmly on the grip of his gun. The tension was palpable. The crowd of onlookers murmured nervously, their phones capturing every second. Marcus held his ground, knowing he needed to stay calm even as the situation grew more dangerous. Just then, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Backup was on the way. For Marcus, it was a sign that things might soon be resolved. For Carter, it only heightened his determination to prove he was in control. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither man would forget. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Officer Carter stood his ground, his fingers twitching near his holstered gun. His heart pounded, though he wouldn't admit it to himself. To him, this man, this so-called chief, was still a threat. Chief Marcus Hale, however, didn't flinch. His years of experience had taught him that staying calm was the best way to diffuse tense situations. He kept his hands visible and his voice steady, even as he noticed Carter's grip tightening. "Officer," Marcus said, his tone measured, "you need to think about what you're doing. When those sirens stop, everyone's going to see the truth. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." But Carter wasn't listening. His mind was clouded by doubt, frustration, and the pressure of the growing crowd. The neighbors whispered among themselves, their phones pointed at the standoff. Carter could feel their judgment, their eyes silently accusing him of wrongdoing. It only fueled his determination to assert his authority. "Quiet," Carter barked at Marcus, his voice sharp. "You don't tell me what to do. You're under suspicion until I say otherwise." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his patience starting to wear thin. "Under suspicion for what? Standing here and doing nothing wrong?" he asked. His calm tone was almost too much for Carter to handle. The sirens stopped, and moments later, 2 patrol cars pulled up. Officers Lisa Ramirez and Mike Jenkins stepped out, their eyes immediately darting to the scene. As soon as they saw Marcus, their expressions shifted from concern to confusion. They knew who Marcus was. He was their new police chief, and his face had been on every department bulletin for the past 2 weeks. "Chief Hale," Ramirez called out, hurrying toward him. "Are you okay?" Carter froze, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. "Wait, what did you say?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Ramirez glanced at Carter, puzzled. "Chief Marcus Hale," she repeated firmly. "Our new police chief. What's going on here?" Carter's grip on his gun loosened, but his pride wouldn't let him admit he was wrong. "Not yet. He doesn't have ID," Carter muttered defensively. "I had to make sure." Marcus sighed, shaking his head. "Officer Carter, I showed you my badge," he said, his tone carrying a hint of frustration now. "You chose not to believe me." Jenkins stepped forward, his expression serious. "Carter, stand down." "Now." The neighbors murmured louder, their phones still recording every moment. Carter hesitated, his face turning red with embarrassment. Slowly, he stepped back, releasing his grip on his weapon. Marcus looked around at the crowd, then back at Carter. "We're going to have a long conversation about this at the station," he said. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried the weight of authority. For Carter, the sinking realization began to settle in. The situation had spiraled out of control, and now there was no going back. Officer Lisa Ramirez and Mike Jenkins exchanged quick glances as they approached the tense scene. Both had heard the dispatch call but hadn't expected to find their new police chief, Marcus Hale, at the center of it. The tension in the air was palpable, with neighbors whispering and holding up their phones, recording every second. "Officer Carter," Ramirez said, her voice firm but calm. "What exactly is going on here?" Carter stiffened, trying to maintain his composure. "I responded to a disturbance call," he began, his tone defensive. "I found this man acting suspiciously near a vehicle. He claimed to be the new chief, but I wasn't sure. I had to take precautions." Ramirez glanced at Marcus, then back at Carter. "Precautions?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Did you verify his identity before escalating?" Carter hesitated, searching for the right words. He showed me a badge, but I thought it could have been fake," he muttered. Jenkins stepped closer, his expression serious. "That's Chief Marcus Hale, Carter. You've seen his photo. You've gotten the emails. How could you not recognize him?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He felt the weight of his mistakes settling on his shoulders. Around him, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their curiosity shifting to judgment. Meanwhile, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward. His calm yet commanding presence instantly quieted the tension. "Officers, I appreciate your timely response," he said, addressing Ramirez and Jenkins. "I wish this situation hadn't escalated, but it's clear we need to address some larger issues within the department." Ramirez nodded, her respect for Marcus evident in her posture. "Understood, Chief. Are you okay?" Marcus nodded. "I'm fine. Just disappointed." Carter's face turned red with embarrassment. "Chief, I was only trying to do my job," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked at Carter, his expression unreadable. "Your job is to serve and protect, Officer Carter. That includes following proper protocol and treating everyone with respect, regardless of your assumptions." Carter swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the crowd's eyes and the cameras still recording. He wanted to defend himself, but deep down, he knew there was no excuse for what had happened. "Stand down, Carter," Jenkins said, his voice firm. "Holster your weapon and step aside." Reluctantly, Carter did as he was told, stepping back while Ramirez and Jenkins took control of the situation. Marcus, still composed, addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for your patience. Please allow us to handle this matter." The neighbors slowly began dispersing, though a few lingered, their phones still raised. The officers guided Marcus to his car, while Carter stood frozen, his pride shattered, and his future uncertain. As the patrol cars pulled away, the weight of the incident lingered. For Marcus, it was just the beginning of uncovering deeper problems in his department. For Carter, it was the start of an unavoidable reckoning. Back at the police station, the air was thick with tension. Word of the incident had already spread, and officers exchanged nervous glances as Chief Marcus Hale walked into the briefing room. His calm demeanor betrayed none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Officer Carter followed behind, his head slightly bowed, aware that all eyes were on him. Marcus turned to face the room, his gaze steady as he addressed the assembled officers. "I want to make one thing clear," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "What happened today was unacceptable, not just for me, but for this department and the community we serve." The room was silent. Even Carter didn't dare to speak. He stood off to the side, his arms crossed, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Marcus continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "We are here to protect and serve all people, regardless of their background, appearance, or circumstances. That means following proper procedures and acting with respect, professionalism, and fairness." Ramirez and Jenkins, seated near the front, nodded in agreement. Other officers shifted in their seats, some looking thoughtful, others avoiding eye contact. It was clear that Marcus's words were hitting home. Turning his attention directly to Carter, Marcus spoke evenly. "Officer Carter, you made a series of poor decisions today. You allowed your assumptions to guide your actions instead of following protocol. You failed to verify my identity properly and escalated a situation that could have been resolved with a simple call to dispatch. Carter's face reddened as he finally looked up. "Chief, I was only trying to protect." He started, but Marcus raised a hand to stop him. "This is not about intentions, Officer Carter," Marcus said firmly. "It's about accountability. Every officer in this room has a responsibility to uphold the values of this department. When we fail to do that, we lose the trust of the community." The room remained silent, the gravity of Marcus's words sinking in. Even those who had initially dismissed him as the new guy couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. "Today's incident is being reviewed by the Internal Affairs Department," Marcus continued. "We will address what happened fairly and transparently. In the meantime, Officer Carter, you are placed on administrative leave effective immediately. You will be required to attend additional training sessions to ensure this does not happen again." Carter opened his mouth as if to protest, but then closed it again, realizing there was nothing he could say to defend himself. He nodded stiffly, muttering, "Yes, Chief." Marcus took a deep breath, scanning the room. "This is not just about one incident," he said, addressing everyone. "This is about creating a culture of accountability, respect, and integrity. I expect all of you to reflect on what happened today and strive to do better." The officers nodded, some more reluctantly than others. Marcus's words hung in the air as the meeting concluded, marking the beginning of a new chapter for the department and for Officer Carter. The days following the incident were anything but quiet at the police department. Internal Affairs had launched a formal investigation to review what had happened between Officer Carter and Chief Marcus Hale. The department buzzed with murmurs and speculation, but one thing was clear: this was not going to be swept under the rug. Chief Hale, true to his word, ensured that the process was transparent. He met with the investigators personally, providing them with his statement and the footage from body cameras and bystander recordings. The videos clearly showed Carter ignoring protocol, escalating the situation, and disregarding Marcus's calm efforts to de-escalate. It painted a picture that was hard to defend. Officer Carter, meanwhile, was feeling the pressure. On administrative leave, he spent his days replaying the events in his mind. His pride had been wounded, and he knew he had made mistakes. But admitting it out loud, that was harder than he imagined. When Internal Affairs called him in for his interview, he walked into the room with his shoulders tense and his face set. "I was doing my job," Carter said defensively when the investigators questioned him about his actions. "I had to make a split-second decision. I thought I was protecting the community." One of the investigators, a sharp-eyed woman named Officer Claire Walker, leaned forward. "Your job is to assess every situation carefully and follow protocol." Chief Hale presented his badge, identified himself, and stayed calm. "Why didn't you take the time to verify his identity?" Carter hesitated, struggling to find the right words. I thought the badge might have been fake," he admitted finally. "And did you try calling dispatch to confirm his identity?" Walker asked, her tone calm but pointed. Carter shook his head, realizing too late how weak his excuse sounded. "No," he muttered. The investigators continued their questioning, but the facts were clear. Carter had acted impulsively, letting his assumptions cloud his judgment. The recordings didn't lie, and neither did his own words. Meanwhile, Marcus focused on using this incident as an opportunity for growth, not just punishment. He met with the department's leadership team, emphasizing the need for ongoing training. "This is about more than one mistake," he told them. "We need to address the systemic issues that allow these kinds of assumptions to take hold. Training, accountability, and communication are key." Marcus also took time to meet with community leaders, assuring them that the situation was being handled appropriately. He knew that trust, once broken, could take years to rebuild, but he was determined to take the first steps. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the department's culture was under scrutiny. Officers began to realize that this wasn't just about Carter's actions. It was about all of them taking responsibility for how they treated their community and each other. For Marcus, it was the beginning of a much-needed change. For Carter, it was the uncomfortable realization that his career and his reputation might never be the same. The investigation concluded within weeks, leaving no doubt about what had happened. The evidence was clear. Officer Carter had acted improperly, failing to follow protocol, and escalating a situation that could have been resolved peacefully. The department announced the findings to the entire team during a meeting, with Chief Marcus Hale leading the discussion. The investigation has shown that Officer Carter's actions were not in line with our department's policies or values, Marcus said, standing at the front of the room. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority. We cannot allow such behavior to go unchecked. It's not just about one person. It's about the integrity of this entire department. The officers in the room sat quietly, absorbing his words. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew this moment was about more than just Officer Carter. It was a wake-up call for the entire department. Carter sat in the back of the room, his face pale. He had been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, he felt a mix of emotions: embarrassment, anger, and a heavy sense of regret. He knew he had made mistakes, but hearing the chief speak so openly about his actions made it harder to ignore the truth. As of today, Marcus continued, Officer Carter's employment with this department has been terminated. This decision was not made lightly, but it is necessary to maintain the trust of the community we serve. The words hit Carter like a punch to the gut. He lowered his head, unable to look anyone in the eye. The reality of losing his job, and the career he had built over 15 years, was almost too much to process. After the meeting, Marcus approached Carter privately. Despite everything that had happened, Marcus believed in second chances and wanted to leave Carter with something meaningful. Officer Carter, Marcus began, his tone softer now. I know this isn't how you imagine things ending, but this doesn't have to define your future. Learn from this. Take the time to reflect on what went wrong and why. Carter looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and gratitude. I messed up, Chief, he said quietly. I let my assumptions get the better of me. I wasn't thinking. Marcus nodded. Acknowledging that is a start. Growth comes from owning our mistakes and working to be better. I hope you'll take this opportunity to do just that. Carter nodded, though the weight of his failure still hung heavily on him. Thank you, Chief, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, for giving me a chance to reflect. As Carter left the station for the last time, he couldn't help but think about the decisions that had led him here. For Marcus and the department, the focus now shifted to rebuilding trust and ensuring that such an incident would never happen again. The days after Officer Carter's departure were a time of reflection and change for the police department. Chief Marcus Hale's leadership had already begun to make a difference, but the incident with Carter still weighed heavily on everyone. The department had come together, but now it was time for action. Marcus had made it clear from the beginning that he wanted transparency and accountability. He didn't want the incident to be swept under the rug, nor did he want it to define his leadership. Instead, he saw it as an opportunity to create lasting change, not just for the department, but for the community they served. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began implementing new training programs. These weren't just about laws or procedures. They focused on understanding bias, communication, and de-escalation tactics. He wanted to ensure that every officer, regardless of experience, had the tools to make better decisions in the heat of the moment. I know this department can be better, Marcus told the officers during one of the first training sessions. We are here to protect people, all people, and that means being aware of how we make decisions. How we act matters. The response was positive, though some officers remained skeptical. For them, the change felt sudden and forced. But Marcus didn't back down. He continued to push for the kind of culture he believed was essential, one of respect, fairness, and understanding. Meanwhile, the community's trust was slowly being rebuilt. The incident had shaken people, but Marcus took the time to meet with community leaders and hold open forums. He listened to concerns and promised to do better. His presence was felt, not just in the department, but throughout the city. One afternoon, Marcus walked through the park near the station, greeting familiar faces and exchanging friendly words with the residents. As he passed by a group of children playing soccer, one of them ran up to him, holding out a drawing. "Look, Chief Hale," the child said proudly. "I made this for you. It's a picture of you helping everyone." Marcus smiled warmly, taking the drawing and admiring it. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "I'll hang this in my office." For Marcus, moments like these made the hard work worth it. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but he also knew that small actions, like showing up and listening, could make a big difference. As for Carter, his journey was just beginning. After leaving the department, he had started to take a hard look at himself. He realized that his assumptions had cost him his career, but he wasn't going to let that define him. Carter began attending counseling and participating in programs that focused on self-awareness and bias. It was a difficult road, but he was determined to become a better person, one step at a time. For Chief Marcus Hale, the work was far from over. The department was stronger now, more united in its mission to serve the community with respect and fairness. And as he walked into the station each day, he knew that the lessons learned from this incident would guide him forward. The department had faced a challenge, but now they were ready for the future, a future built on trust, integrity, and growth. The airport buzzed with the usual rush of travelers, but Vivian felt like she was walking in a different world. As she made her way to her next gate, she couldn't stop thinking about her encounter with Daniel. She had spent the entire flight assuming he didn't belong in first class, only to find out he was a successful CEO, someone far beyond what she had imagined. Vivian had always prided herself on her sharp judgment. She was used to sizing people up based on their clothes, their accents, and the way they carried themselves. But this experience had shaken that belief. She had learned a lesson she hadn't expected, and one she couldn't ignore. She sat down on a bench near her gate, her mind racing. How many times had she judged people in the past without really knowing them? How many opportunities had she missed to connect with others, simply because she had dismissed them based on appearances? Daniel had been a mirror to her own faults. He was kind, humble, and unbothered by her rude comments, and yet he had shown more class than she ever could have imagined. Vivian felt a sudden rush of gratitude. Daniel hadn't raised his voice or snapped back at her. He had remained composed and showed her the dignity she had lacked. He hadn't needed to prove anything to her. Instead, he had quietly taught her the value of humility and respect. The more she thought about it, the more Vivian realized that it wasn't just about being kind to others. It was about understanding them too. People weren't defined by their appearance or their social status. There was more to everyone than what met the eye. As she waited for her flight, Vivian began to make a mental list of things she wanted to change about her approach to people. She knew she had a lot to learn, but this encounter had sparked a desire to become more open-minded, more thoughtful. The announcement for her flight came over the loudspeaker, and Vivian stood up, gathering her things. But before she boarded, she paused. For a brief moment, she looked around the crowded terminal, seeing it through new eyes. Everyone around her had their own story, their own struggles, and their own dreams. And each person, no matter who they were, deserved to be treated with respect and kindness. As the plane took off and she gazed out the window, Vivian made a silent promise to herself. She would never again let assumptions shape her view of others. She would take the time to understand people before judging them. After all, no one's worth could be measured by the clothes they wore or the way they spoke. The lesson Daniel had unknowingly taught her wasn't just about how to treat others. It was about how to treat herself. By showing respect to those around her, Vivian could create the kind of world she wanted to live in. A world where people looked beyond appearances and saw the value in each other, no matter their status or background. Vivian smiled to herself, feeling lighter, more at peace. It had been an awkward and uncomfortable flight, but it had been the most important one of her life, and it was a journey she wouldn't forget. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight attendants collected the empty trays from dinner service. The soft hum of the airplane engines was interrupted only by the occasional clink of glasses or quiet conversation between passengers. Vivian, however, remained restless. She shifted in her seat, glancing repeatedly at Daniel, as if waiting for him to do something worth criticizing. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He had finished his meal, neatly folded his napkin, and was now jotting notes in a small leather notebook. His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate Vivian more. She leaned back in her seat with a sigh, staring out the window. When Daniel accidentally dropped his pen, it rolled toward Vivian's feet. He leaned over slightly and said, "Excuse me," in a polite tone. But before he could reach for it, Vivian picked it up and handed it to him with an exaggerated smile. "You're welcome," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Daniel took the pen and smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said, as though her tone didn't bother him at all. He returned to his notebook, and once again, Vivian found herself annoyed. As the flight continued, Vivian decided to strike up a conversation with a fellow passenger across the aisle, a man wearing a crisp suit. Loud enough for Daniel to hear, she said, "Don't you think first class is losing its charm? It used to feel exclusive, but now it's just crowded." The man looked a bit startled by the question, but nodded politely, clearly not wanting to engage in anything controversial. "I suppose things have changed a bit," he said, offering a neutral reply before turning back to his tablet. Vivian smiled, satisfied that she had made her point. She glanced at Daniel, expecting some kind of reaction, but he remained focused on his notebook. His calmness felt infuriating to her, though she couldn't quite explain why. The flight attendants returned to offer drinks and desserts. When Daniel requested herbal tea, Vivian raised her eyebrows and muttered, "How quaint." She laughed softly, as if expecting others to join in. This time, Daniel looked at her directly. His gaze was steady, and though his expression was friendly, there was a quiet strength in his tone. "I find it relaxing," he said simply. Vivian blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the firmness in his voice. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The awkward silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than it actually was. Other passengers began to notice the tension between the two. A few exchanged glances, clearly wondering what was going on. Some looked curious. Others looked uncomfortable. Vivian crossed her arms and turned away, staring out the window again. She tapped her fingers on the armrest, her frustration growing. Meanwhile, Daniel leaned back in his seat, took a sip of his tea, and calmly resumed his work. The tension hung in the air, but if it bothered him, he gave no sign of it.